Hey gang, see there's a little lake right up ahead. It's called Park Lake. Let's go. This is part of the Lake Shetek Natural Park. People camp here. People enjoying nature. People enjoying the bugs. I'm sprayed up. But this exact spot right in here is where there was a famous massacre of pioneers. Lake Shetek Indian Massacre, it was called. And this, right on the shores of this beautiful little Park Lake, there was a small settlement of the pioneers. And the people we're going to be talking about, the family we're going to be talking about, is Lavina Eastlick, John, her husband, the kids, the boys. It was a sad story, but this story shows that there was a hero, a little boy. His name was Merton. He's one of the sons, 12 years old. He was born in July of 1851. He had 4 brothers, Frank, Frederick, Giles, and Johnny. They had moved initially to Illinois from the east in 1856, but the price of land was too high. There was already a lot of people there. Now, they settled here with a group of others. There might have been 50 pioneers here living the good life, the simple life. But they're so isolated here, they would have no idea that there would be an uprising with the Sioux Dakotas. They had been on the reservation for some 8 years. Not far from here, considering, and they were starving. They were not given their promised annuities from the government. What else is new? Right, we know that history. Now, the Civil War had started, so a lot of the soldiers were taken out of here and all other places, all the way down to Texas, Arizona. And the Native Americans had free reign. Now, in this area, it was like a ticking time bomb. And on August 17th, 1862, that bomb would go off. It all started with an unprovoked murder of some white settlers by 4 young Sioux natives. And of course, it quickly escalated. A month later, the natives were routed by troops under Colonel Henry Hopkins Sibley, but it would not be before many of the combatants had spread out to go on this rampage against nearby white settlements, ranches, homesteads. And so it would happen here, right here. Now, we're right on the shore here of this little Park Lake that connects to the big lake. And I imagine this area was more cleared out for the pioneers. And as it turned out, on that morning, Mom, Lavina, was preparing breakfast, as usual, for the family. And a man named Mr. Rhodes, who was a boarder living with them. And suddenly, Merton came to the door and he said, "Charlie Hatch is coming, as fast as he can run." Now, Lavina, thinking someone was hurt, ran to the door and asked Charlie, their neighbor, What's the matter? He said, the Indians were upon them, and they already shot Voigt, one of the neighbors. So Charlie asked for a horse so that he could warn the other settlers, and after giving Charlie a horse, the Eastlick family fled. like other families, they went to a cabin right here on these shores that was owned by John Wright. Why did they go there? His cabin was the biggest. It was the strongest. And they would make a fortress out of that cabin. Now, there were Sioux living with these settlers right here. And they were friendly, they were friends, they were working here, they were allies. The leader was a man named Pawn. And they trusted them. They trusted them completely. But they would soon discover that the trust would be deceived. And the price of that error would be great. Very great. There were 6 teepees here, right around Mr. Wright's cabin, and when everyone came together, the natives, they waved their arms. They're saying, "Come, hurry, hurry." And they were running around. "We will defend you." Soon there were 30 people gathered here, men, women, and children right here. They prepared the Wright cabin for a siege. They knocked out the chinking out between the logs for gun ports. And at the same time the men were getting the women upstairs, they were planning to defend to the last. Then Pawn told them, he came, they opened the door, and he said, he came inside and he said, "Fire your guns. That will scare the Indians." So the men fired their guns into the air, came out. But 3 Indians in the house did not come out and fire their guns. It seemed kind of odd. Now, these were many single-shot guns, so you know where this is going. The Indians on horseback soon came in sight, and Pawn and those Indians inside, they went out to meet with them. Pawn made the meeting, and he came back inside, and he said, "There were a great many Indians here, and they're going to burn this house down. You should all flee to the timber." Well, this threw a major wrench into the plan. It threw everybody, all the men, into confusion. What are we going to do? Some wanted to stay, some wanted to go. It was chaos. In the end, most of them decided to flee across the prairie to another settler's house, and they literally left here, this shoreline, and they started running that way. And there's open prairie there, and they were just running for their lives. And they would, don't quote me on this, a quarter mile away, something like that, there's a slough. Call it now Slaughter Slough, and you know what happened there. Most of them made it there, and that is where they met their end. We're going to go there now. There's a big rock, commemoration rock. We're going to go there, and I'm going to tell you all the things that happened, because Lavina was a survivor, and she was a witness to it all. So let's go. Well, we found it, and there is a pull-off right at the side of the road here, and there's no doubt where you're at when you see this sign. Very easy to find, and let me tell you, it is not a quarter mile away. It's got to be 3 to 4 miles. Don't quote me, but I can't even imagine that they were just running for their lives that far. Now, we're probably a quarter mile away from the spot where it happened, which is great. I can walk to it. There looks like there's a trail, a mowed trail here, well, partially mowed. So we can walk the trail, and I can tell you how it went down. There is a big rock there that we're going to see. story of the stones. So look at this. So this gives you a map. We are here, so we're going to go to that area. And they talk about the Dakotas and the settlers at Lake Shetek, and then the Lakota. Hunkpapa. Stunning, stunning vista. You just try to put yourself back in the time. Yeah. I like to go to these places because you can stand where they stood, where they died. Well, the story continues. Basically, as they ran to this location, two of the men, Mr. Smith and Mr. Rhodes, were cowards. They took off. They were all yelling, shouting at them as they ran. They abandoned the group. Just then, after they were gone, many of the warriors started surrounding the people. You know where we're going here. They were laying down in this grass, down flat. And of course, the men told the women to take the children to this swamp. As they ran and laid down here, they were all taking gunfire. Lavina took a bullet to the heel of her foot, and she kept running. Can you imagine? But a lot of the others were getting hit and they were going down. Most of them did make it to the tall grass here. They hid, they laid down. And as I look at it, I get the feeling, you have to imagine that they were like fawns, like deer, hiding in the brush, not breathing, hearing their hearts pound, trying not to move a muscle, hoping that the warriors would not find them. But how could they not find them? The warriors, in the meantime, were having fun. This was recreation. They were laughing. And after a certain amount of time, the pioneers were entirely surrounded here. Many of them were bleeding, wounded, and shots just started coming in like crazy from all sides. They're just taking hit after hit, and you have to imagine that you are laying here, and from the descriptions from Lavina, you could hear the moans. You could hear the balls hitting the body, the shells, the bullets, they called them balls. And you could hear the thud, and you could hear the oh, or the scream. And kids too. They're shooting at everybody. The screaming, the crying, the children calling for their mother. There was nowhere to go. The Indians, they kept laughing, and they kept up with the assault. One of the men who was hit but still alive was Mr. Everett. The warriors called out to him, and then Pawn spoke. Pawn was here. He followed them, the treacherous Pawn. He said, "You come to me." And he was trying to trick them to give up. Mrs. Everett yelled back at Pawn, and he said, come out and bring Mrs. Wright with you," because, he said later, he wanted to make them his wives. So Mrs. Everett, really, there's no choice, right? She got Mrs. Wright, and they gathered up the children, and they walked out to Pawn. Yeah. As Lavina got up, she noticed that husband John was dead. John was only 29 years old. Many of them were so young, these pioneers. All the women and children were now coming forward one by one, and maybe smart because different warriors were taking them on their horse, and they would gallop off. Taking them as prisoners, they would become slaves. They would be abused. Some would be ransomed back, some would not. Some integrated into the tribes. And they became, if they're young enough. Now, Lavina's son Charlie was having a tough time. There was this, and they call it at the time squaw, the Indian woman was fixated on him, on Charlie, and she started beating him, just beating him. He'd get up and she'd knock him down, and several times she picked him up. She threw him to the ground. Poor guy, his face was covered in blood. Again, this is all described by Lavina in her book. Imagine how she felt. She's watching. What can she do? There's nothing she can do. Watch your child be abused like that, screaming. And Lavina's other little son, Frank, he was on his knees with his hands up calling, "Mother, mother." He had blood running out of his mouth like a stream. Then Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Ireland were just shot on the spot, blown away. And at that moment, Lavina said, "Oh, Merton, here, take baby Johnny. Go as long as you can. Just go. Run, run." So Merton cradled his baby brother and he took off. And nobody saw him. None of the warriors, even Pawn. Pawn came over and told Lavina to move on, that she could leave. So Lavina gets up and she starts to walk away. What does Pawn do? Pawn shoots her in the back. Yeah. Well, after a long while, things finally started to die down. Most were dead. But surprisingly, Merton, in fact, had stayed nearby. He didn't run off. He got far enough away and he listened and he waited. Well, all the warriors had left. But there were 5 men still alive, most severely wounded. One who was very severely wounded was a man named Tommy Ireland. Even though he wasn't a relative, he was affectionately known as Uncle Tommy by all the children. So Merton tried to help him, and after a few hours of rest, Tommy said, "We gotta go." In his mind, he was going to save the Eastlick boys, but he couldn't move. So he told Merton to carry the baby on his back and that they would try to make it to Charlie Hatch's place, cabin. Tommy could only walk a few hundred yards. He kept trying, but he kept collapsing. So Merton looked at him with tears in his eyes. He didn't know how to help him. He didn't want to leave him, but Tommy told him there was nothing he could do. Keep on. Save little Johnny. So Merton grabbed a pile of leaves and grass, placed them under Tommy's head as a pillow, then kissed him on the cheek. And with that, he was given directions by Tommy where to try to go and to keep walking until somebody found them. Don't give up. Merton lifted his 15-month-old brother upon his back and he started across the prairie, this prairie. And over the next several days, he would carry his little brother many, many miles. Many miles. How did they live? How did they get by? They ate berries, they ate grass, they ate whatever they could. Merton would stay up all night shouting to the wolves. Again, there were wolves here then. Keep them awake while the baby slept. When it rained, he laid his brother on the ground and bent over him to protect him from the cold rain. What a hero. By the 7th day, Merton was weak, but he still went on carrying his little brother. They were heading to a settlement called New Ulm, a long way away. Meanwhile, Lavina was still trying to make her way out. I mean, I think she laid there for, gosh, hours, if not a full day, unconscious, conscious, and finally she was able to get up, surprisingly, with all her wounds, and stumble away. She would stumble away. I have to tell you, there are really sad, poignant moments to this story I want to share with you that stood out to me of what Lavina relayed of the children from her book. One of the children, whose name was William Dooley, in the dark as she laid there that first night, he was calling out maybe 30 yards away or so, "Mother, mother." And then he shouted out, "Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith?" No answer. And Lavina would stay silent. What could she do? What if she would have answered? She would have just given the boy hope. She was almost dead. There was little 3-year-old babe, Julianne Ireland, a baby. She was shot in the leg. She was sleeping on the bosom of her dead mother, Sophia. And then little Lily Everett, who I believe survived. Little Lily was asking for a drink, just to anyone who would listen. And then she said, "Is there water in heaven? Is there?" So Lavina got out of there. She figured if she could get help, they could come back. There's nothing she could do. There was nothing she could do. With little food she could gather from the site of the attack, and with her severe wounds, she hid and she made her way slowly across this prairie, hiding and traveling mostly by night. After several days, she thought she was seeing things. Off in the distance, she saw the mail carrier. It was a man named August Garzone. He had his wagon. He was traveling his regular route from Sioux Falls to New Ulm. He had been gone for a week. He was completely unaware. I mean, guys, they didn't have cell phones back there. They didn't have any of this communication. It was word of mouth. So he had no idea. It's like, what's going on here? What happened to you? And then she told him all about the attacks. Well, after he heard and saw her horrible condition, he helped her into his sulky, which is a two-wheeled horse-drawn cart, you know, the kind of thing they use in harness racing. And he would walk along leading the horse, heading to New Ulm. Now here's another sign here. It says the New Ulm to Sioux Falls Trail. So interesting. So a trail here. Now we're here, and this is where it happened. Now, by the way, I can see the boulder out there, and I'll put the zoom on. There it is. So that's where we're going. That is where they were killed. But here, this was known as the Shetek Trail. Began as a deer bison trail, which was later used by Native Americans. Survivors of the Slaughter Slough event made their way this way, their way east to escape. They talk about Lavina, Merton, Johnny, Tommy, Ireland. It's all here. Interestingly, look at this. Nearly 14 years later, the James Younger gang tried to escape over this trail following a failed bank robbery. Northfield. Oh, the Northfield. Wow. Well, they were pretty shot up. What was left of them. All right, let's continue to the boulder. Well, interestingly, along the way, they stopped at Charlie Hatch's place. They made it there, and to their amazement, were reunited with Tommy Ireland. He was still alive. He made it there. And the next day, a few of the others straggled in, and they all set out for New Ulm. The following day, they approached a woman named Alamina Hurd and her two children. Alamina told Lavina that Merton was just a short distance ahead, carrying Johnny. Imagine her delight. Imagine, with all the pain and wounds and bleed, the life that just breathed into Lavina. She was ecstatic. She was praying to the Lord. Thank you. So they urged the horse along, and they all walking together, they soon came upon them, and she laid eyes on Merton and her baby boy. They had been without food for several days. Weak. Little Johnny was unrecognizable. He looked like a caveman child. Very ill. It was said that cholera was setting in. His face was completely disfigured from being covered with mosquito bites that he'd been scratching, and his hair pulled out from the back of his head. And poor Merton, the flesh was actually worn off his feet. He was so weakened and dazed that he was unable to speak for several days. He was in shock. It would turn out that it would be 80 miles that Merton had covered with his little baby brother. 80 miles. So with tears of joy, Lavina thanked God, but she was not able to get up from the sulky to hug him. She could only press his wasted hand and call him my dear brave boy, quote unquote. So they all stopped at Mr. Brown's house, and the mail carrier left for New Ulm. Unbelievably, he was attacked by warriors, but he was able to escape. He came back to the Brown's house. He did his best for the survivors there, who were now unable to even travel. And then he's decided to leave for Sioux Falls, hoping to send soldiers back here to rescue them. So what could they do? All they could do is scrounge for whatever food they could find over the next few days. Tommy Ireland, despite his wounds, decided he would try to reach New Ulm and send a party back, a rescue party. Against all odds, he did it. He reached New Ulm. Soldiers and fellow neighbors who had survived the attack, they came back all together, the loyalty. And they picked up the survivors at the Browns' cabin. It was on September 5th that the group of soldiers escorted the Herds, the Eastlicks, Tommy Ireland, and Mrs. Wright from New Ulm to Mankato. And of course, where Lavina was finally there, treated for her wounds. Now, interesting footnote that I want to share with you to this part of the story is that there was a Lakota woman that helped. Now, there were many good Native Americans, and her and her husband really took a chance, and they sacrificed a lot of their personal belongings. And I'm talking about blankets and rifles and horses. That's what they would do to try to trade. Her name was Matilda Galpin. eagle woman that all look at. And her husband was Charles Gulpin. They were instrumental in rescuing many of these women and children that were taken captive. Charles was in charge of Indian trade along the Missouri River, and when he and his wife were traveling by boat down the river, they discovered the captives. On November 3rd, he docked his boat, and he told the trader, who was there and had a station there, about the captives, and they formed a rescue party. How did they do that? Well, they recruited 10 friendly Teton Lakota, and they were ones who had opposed the uprising, the war, and they were called the Fool Soldiers. And you saw the sign, the Fool Soldiers, the Lakota. That's what we're talking about from that sign at the beginning at the parking lot. And why were they called that? Well, it was for the high risk of these rescue missions. And the Lakota successfully negotiated, as I said, trading their own horses, which were invaluable, priceless. Food, blankets, guns, ammunition. And they got the release of the captives. And if that's not enough, they bundled the captives who were hurting so bad in their blankets, their moccasins, and the women, the Lakota women, they helped carry the children, helping them leave the area quickly. So, that's the story, guys. Harrowing. And we're approaching the boulder, and I'm looking around here, and you can see this tall grass and these well, they almost look like tumbleweed. I'm not sure what this is. You can probably tell me, but it's not much cover. Now again, this was later in the year, and I'm sure this was all grown up by then. There's the boulder, guys. So we're going to go up there, and we're going to try and imagine what it was like for these poor people. There are many stories. And then you go to Texas. I've got so many stories in Texas like this. It was a tough time. So here it is, the boulder. Let's take a look. So we're on some high ground here. And I have to believe that that's what you typically do in a defensive position. You take high ground in this high grass. And then you wait. Yeah. Looks like it says it's a waterfowl production area now. It's nice that they commemorated this. Now this talks here, it looks like, about the attack, most of which I've already told you about. Let's just see what this says. Oh, Charlie Hatch. I don't know who he was. So here are interesting, these are some of, there's Lake, oh, this is fantastic. Now, when we opened it, we were right here on Park Lake. I was standing right where my finger is, on the shores of Park Lake. And that was the Eastlick cabin right off the shore. And you can see how spread out everybody was. There's the Wright cabin. That's where they were trying to, that's where they all went to. And there's the Ireland cabin, and they're all strung out. These beautiful places. But Charlie Hatch was the brother of Elmira Everett. Interesting. He was 24 years old. And he's the one that was warning all the settlers. Can you imagine the terror as he's riding? And they only have minutes, if not seconds. Well, you look out here, and I can't imagine. Lake Shetek is that direction right there. And trying to imagine, you can't, I mean, we're 3 to 4 miles that they ran this far. It's unbelievable. They must have been, imagine their feet, and they're all scratched up, and the bugs and the wounds, and open prairie. I don't know what else they could have done. I don't know if there was any better way. Okay, we are now going to go to a big monument where many of these people are in a mass grave or buried. And then from there we're going to go to Rochester, and we're going to go to Merton's grave. All right, let's go. We are back now on Lake Shetek, the state park, and the lake is just beyond this monument. And this is where many are buried, many of those who didn't survive. Look at the monument they made, it's beautiful. Surrounded by a fence. It says courage, patriotism was erected in 1924 by the state of Minnesota. And we cannot go in. I don't think this, look at this arrangement. Well, it's okay. That's okay. We don't need to go stepping on graves. I don't know if they're in a mass grave. I imagine they're not. I imagine they're in rows, but you can see the burial, so they were buried in separate coffins. It says a military and civilian burial. A military and civilian burial detail interred the remains of the settlers killed at the slough. All remains were placed in 7 wood coffins in family groups and then buried side by side. So yeah, families are in 1 coffin each. And you can see a picture here. By the way, it says at the bottom, the body of Isabel Dooley was not among the victims first buried. She was taken captive and later killed near Wright's cabin. Her body was found identified by her father during the 1863 burial expedition. So here's a picture of, well, you can see the Model Ts, 1925. All the model, look at that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. So I'm counting the rows. That's a lot of people were here, imagine. You can see here it says, and dedicated to the memory of those who were slain in the Lake Shetek Indian Massacre of August 20th, 1862, and to commemorate the privations and hardships and the heroic deeds of the surviving pioneer settlers of Murray County and vicinity. That's right. It says Fidelity on this side. J.E. Baxter, Henry Paul, C.A. Portman, Monument Commission. I don't know if you can see that. Let me see if I can't walk over there, but it's the auto light. There we go. The light sensor. Just wanted to make sure you could see that. Okay. And here we have the victims, which you can read, and I will zoom in, those who are buried here. This side it says humanity. Almira Hatch Everett, wife of William Everett, Willie Everett, age 5, Charlie Everett, age 2, Sophia Waters Ireland, wife of Thomas Ireland. We talked about Tommy Ireland and the babe sleeping on Sophia's bosom. Sarah Jane Ireland, age 5, Julie Ann Ireland, age 3. You can see they really lost practically the whole family. Tommy did. Sophia Smith, wife of Henry Smith, John Voight. Andrew, looks like Andrew Kobik, I can't read that name. John Eastlick, of course, age 29. Frederick Eastlick, age 4. Giles Eastlick, age 2. William J. Dooley Jr., age 10, and Belle Dooley, age, I think it's 8 or 3. It's hard to say. Let me zoom in. Oh, that's his, I believe that's a 6. So, this is where they are interred. I think the state did a wonderful job here, and they really keep this area up nice. Grass mowed. Look at that. And then here, there's a trail, and you can walk down to a part of Lake Shetek there beyond. Okay, so I am going to take you now to Rochester, Minnesota, far to the east, and we're going to go to the grave of the boy hero, Merton Eastlick. We are now in Rochester, Minnesota at Oakwood Cemetery. Beautiful town here. If any of you are from Rochester, I gotta tell you, you have a beautiful place here. Anyway, picking up the story. So what happened next? Well, Lavina and the children moved to Ohio, and they went to live with their family there, you know, getting back on their feet. And they were there for 3 years. Now, this is when she wrote her book that first winter. And from the proceeds of that book, she did pretty well and was able to buy some land just west of here. About 80 miles west of here is Mankato, the town. And the neighbors there helped Lavina and family build a frame house. And it was looking good. It was looking better, I should say. Merton was doing well, considering. He had learned the trade of carpentry, and he was doing some work on that house. He was doing some great things. He added a kitchen to it. He added a couple bedrooms, and he added a buttery. He had learned that trade of carpentry, and he was making money, supporting the family. Well, in 1870, Lavina married a man, Solomon Pettibone. But interestingly, 3 months later, Solomon said, you know, I want to go see my sister back in Ohio. where your family is. So he left. And 3 months later, he left and he never came back. He was at his sister's, it is said, but when he left his sister's, he never came back. Lavina's daughter from that marriage was born shortly thereafter, August following summer. And interestingly, Johnny, little Johnny, was now 10 years old. And he helped Mom care for the baby. And he was kind of becoming the man of the house already at 10. And the neighbors helped, but Merton was moving on. He had gotten married. August 19th, 1873, he married a woman named Mary Ann Alexander from here in Rochester. And this is where they settled. They had one son here named Merton William. He was actually born in Mankato on May 23rd, 1874. Now, very sadly, Merton didn't do so well right after that. He had a cough that developed, and we're going to talk about it. He got very, very sick. He's only 24 years old. And Lavina, of course, not being here in Rochester, over in Mankato, 80 miles away, she had to get on the train and try and get here. And he was calling for her because he knew he was dying. So what I'm going to do is read a letter that Lavina had written. It's actually part of the book. I'll quote it, and it is heartbreaking to read, I have to tell you. The mother's love. 1862 by Lavina Eastlick. Sometime during the summer of 1875, Merton wrote me, telling me that he had taken a severe cold and had been left with a cough. He wrote several letters afterwards saying that all was well, but a terrible blow awaited me on the 5th of November. I received a telegram from Rochester to come quick, Merton is dying. Oh, what a shock. I did not faint, but I thought I should die. It was such a shock. I could not speak for some minutes, but tears, blessed tears, came to my relief. And then I seemed to realize the truth that Merton was dying. I thought perhaps I might get to Rochester in time to see him once more if I made all possible haste, and I accordingly went to Mankato that night and took the train next morning bound for Rochester. How slow the train moved. It seemed as though I could go faster myself. In my imagination, I could see another train that didn't lack for speed. I knew where it would stop and what passenger would go on board. I finally reached Rochester at 1 in the morning. Mr. Joseph Alexander Jr. met me at the station, and I did not need to ask. I felt that Merton was gone. Mary, my daughter-in-law, met me at the gate. She threw her arms around me, she kissed me, and she said, "Mother." She could say no more, and I could say nothing. Neither could I shed a tear. They told me that Merton begged them to do all they could to keep life in him till Mother came. And he told his wife if he could see Mother, he would be willing to die. He died trusting in Jesus. On Sunday, I followed his remains to the grave where kind hands buried the hero of Lake Shetek, my hero, the boy that carried his little brother so far and was the instrument in the hands of God in saving his life. And this, my friends, is the cemetery, and this is the spot right here where they came, where Lavina stood. This famous woman stood right here, right at his grave, where I'm going to show you right now. This was a stone that was erected much later. I see 1962. I'm sure he had one of those old tablet stones for many a year. But it says Merton Eastlick, 1851 to 1875, the boy hero of the Indian Massacre of 1862. And this was put up by the Olmsted County Historical Society. Kudos to you. Kudos to you for doing that. Well, as I stand here, this really gives me, I've done a lot of episodes. We've talked a lot about many of these stories, but this particular story really has touched me, and I really wish that I could almost just put my hand on Merton's, on your shoulder, buddy. I wish I could just say, what a fine young man. What a fine young man, what a fine boy, taken so early. It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. Yes, he was the boy hero. Imagine 80 miles, how many days, all the hardships with his baby brother who survived because of him. What a good young man. Rest in peace, Merton. Rest in peace.